Hi, I'm Bob Pratt, a docent here at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. Today, let me tell you about a painting in our permanent collection that's been one of my favorites for decades. This is Allegory by Ben Shahn from 1948. We're lucky to have it because it's strikingly beautiful and because it's a pivotal work in Shahn's long career. It's in oil on a canvas filled with a monstrous red beast, gaunt, fanged, and clawed, flames engulfing his head like a lion's mane. Underneath him is a pile of 4 tiny bodies, unconscious, their sprawled limbs deathly white. At first glance, it's like a child's drawing, direct and simple. But look closely. The white lines are the bare minimum to establish the beast's predator teeth, lion nose, and demented, impersonal stare. The mane is done with striated overlapping colors that suggest translucent tongues of flame separating as their ends fade into smoke. An indistinct yellow patch that might be a sun or moon struggles in the haze. The background is a patchy chaos of layered blues and grays with warm colors bleeding through. Notice how the layering continues over the beast itself, keeping it in a dark, murky atmosphere. Underneath the starving beast, it's curiously brighter, a more innocent space for the children below. On the left is a tiny landscape set apart from the scene. We'll have more to say about that later. Overall, the painting is a haunting image, and when decoded, it turns out to be a deeply personal statement. In 1906, Shahn and his family came to New York from Lithuania, then part of the Russian Empire, and he always identified with the polyglot immigrant experience. He loved books, but at 14, his mother pulled him out of school to help support the family. He took a job as a lithographer's apprentice, and by 19 was a master lithographer. In the long run, this background would serve him well. It made him comfortable with drawn text in multiple languages, color overlays, print and poster making, and in general, with careful detail. He would apply these skills doing commercial art as well as fine art. His wife Bernarda said that he approached all his work for magazines, murals, or museums the same way. His neat and tidy work area was not a studio, he called it his shop. Shahn had continued to take academic classes at night and later studied at NYU, City College, and the National Academy of Design. Then he and his first wife made what he called the traditional artist pilgrimage to Europe and North Africa. He was impressed with painters like Giotto and Lorenzetti and the early Renaissance shift to naturalistic poses and gestures. He wrote approvingly about Goya's commitment to exposing the agonies of his age. Shahn immersed himself in the new art of the continent. He experimented in the styles of Cézanne and Matisse. Like them, he approached pure abstraction, but never fully crossed over. On his return to the United States, he decided that his European experiments were unoriginal, and beyond that, they did not satisfy. Shahn's internal critic, which he called a ruthless destroyer, demanded more from him. His art would have to reflect the process of trial and rejection, what he called the long artistic tug-of-war between image and ideas. Those ideas would have to be his own and be grounded in the real world. Later, he would call himself the most American of American painters. Shahn has always been associated with justice for the underdog. Early on, his ideas crystallized into images about the high-profile social causes of his time. His work reached back to the Dreyfus Affair, a notorious case of anti-Semitism in the French military. He was employed by Diego Rivera on the mural Man at the Crossroads at Rockefeller Plaza. That was the mural removed by the Rockefeller family for its radical political depictions. Shahn himself first gained public attention with a series of paintings about Sacco and Vanzetti, 2 Italian immigrant anarchists who were executed after a famously biased trial. Shahn publicized the deaths of 3 civil rights workers in 1964 Mississippi. His portrait of Martin Luther King appeared on the cover of Time magazine. And most pointedly here, he illustrated an in-depth Harper's Magazine article on Chicago's Hickman fire, a case involving arson, murder, and the death of children. As we'll see, Allegory is derived partly from those illustrations. Our painting was part of a new theme for Shahn. His older work dealt with specifics. During the Depression and the Second World War, he focused on documentary-style realism. Walker Evans, a longtime friend and studio partner, gave Shahn a camera and a couple of sentences on how to shoot pictures. That was enough. Working for the Federal Resettlement Administration and its successor, the Farm Security Administration, Shahn and his wife Bernarda toured the American South, recording the displacement and poverty there. Like his colleagues Evans and Dorothea Lange, Shahn recorded social history. Unlike them, he was also on the lookout for material he might turn into paintings. Here, two elderly ladies go from photo to canvas. In another example, see how New York handball players go from a candid photo to a stylized painting. The style of such documentary art was often called social realism, but Shahn rejected that label, instead calling his work personal realism. He didn't think of masses and movements, but of how broad concerns were reflected in individual lives. Allegory is one of Shahn's mature works where he shifted focus from relentless specifics to creating his own symbolism. His second allegory, for instance, depicts another personified threat. Here it's a crushing and accusing hand, perhaps descending from flaming atomic clouds, perhaps with the linear simplifications of science hovering in the background. Our allegory is also not obvious, but fortunately for us, we don't have to guess at its intent. Shahn gave a series of lectures at Harvard that were collected in his book, The Shape of Content. One of those lectures, The Biography of a Painting, outlined the personal sources that led Shahn to allegory, the ideas, if you will, that tugged these images onto the canvas. The first source he cites is the Hickman case we've already mentioned. In that case, a black steelworker in Chicago came home to find that 4 of his children had burned to death in their ghetto attic apartment. The landlord, also a black man, had threatened to burn the family out if they didn't leave. Hickman stewed about this for 7 months, then confronted the landlord, who Hickman maintained confessed to setting the fire. Hickman shot him and he died 3 days later. The case became nationally famous because it highlighted the overcrowding and filthy conditions forced on Southern blacks who immigrated to Chicago's slums, and the impossibility of finding justice in the courts. Harper's Magazine ran an extensive article on the case, and Shahn created the illustrations. The burning attic and the piled children translate directly into allegory. By the way, Hickman's trial resulted in a hung jury. The authorities decided that in losing his children, he had already paid enough. Another source is the universally known Roman sculpture, the Capitoline Wolf. Here, Romulus and Remus, the fabled founders of Rome, are suckled by a she-wolf who took them in as orphan foundlings. Shahn said he always dreaded seeing this sculpture. In the Russian fables of his boyhood, wolves ate babies, they didn't raise them. Also contributing were fires in Shahn's family history. As a boy, Shahn witnessed the burning of the Russian village where his grandfather lived. We may see a reference to the village here at the edge of the painting. Imagine looking away from the fire to see the surrounding tree trunks painted red by reflected flame. Compare that with the red branches in this Shahn painting of a man carrying something precious, perhaps a child, away from the scene of a fire. Shahn also cited a family house fire in America. He remembered how his father was burned and scarred when he had to climb a drain pipe on the building and lift each of his children to safety. Shahn also mentioned his work with the U.S. Office of War Information, the OWI. In that capacity, he had access to classified pictures of the horrors of the European war. He saw cities he knew reduced to rubble, dead and brutalized children, altogether unforgettable images. Few of the posters Shahn made for the OWI were put into production. They were considered too stark, too harsh. When the OWI came to be managed by advertisers, he left, disillusioned with government in general. Back to our painting. An allegory is a fable used to develop some underlying theme or idea. So what's the theme? What's the sum of these ideas? Shahn said it was the emotional tone that surrounds disaster. You might call it the inner disaster. Here we find smoke and flame, fallen children, an impersonal chimeric beast desperate in its hunger. Disaster indeed. Shahn has turned away from headlines and looked for universal emotions drawn from his own experience. My take on this inner disaster is that it needs some unpacking. The beast is not necessarily the villain here. The children are not burned. The beast is not attacking them. Shahn said they were not the Hickman children, nor Romans. They reminded him more of his own brothers and sisters. The emotions that surround disaster may be fear and mourning, but they also may be outrage, anger to the point of combustion, an imperative to protect the innocent. Certainly these must have been in Shahn's mind at the Office of War Information when he saw pictures of death camps and starving children. The beast astride the bodies may be protecting them, a kind of demonic guard dog called up by any sane person's horror over such cruelty. In that view, the beast is almost noble. In fact, Shahn seems to have identified with the beast image and continued to use it as a sort of talisman. It's on the cover of his book. It appears inside with a Hebrew inscription, "Where there is a book, there is no sword." And there's another fund of cultural symbols for Shahn. Shahn began to portray the universal in religious symbols and ceremony. Though not particularly observant himself, he was a child of Jewish immigrants from the Tsarist Russian Empire. Remarkably, the same is true of several other artists in our permanent collection. In that tradition, we can find the heroic Lion of Judah, fourth son of Jacob in the Torah, and another name for Jesus in some Christian sects. That lion appeared in the Ethiopian flag, the emblem of Jerusalem, and perhaps in Shahn's own third allegory, where a somewhat more civilized lion carries tablets accompanied by the blowing of a shofar. The gist of this seems to be wake up to the Ten Commandments. Probably more to the point is the family name. When Shahn was 4, his father was arrested and sent to Siberia for allegedly revolutionary activities. When he was being hauled away, he called back to his family to go to America. Over 4 years, the father would escape, travel secretly, and make his way via South Africa to his family's door in Brooklyn. You can't make this stuff up. But Shahn's mother, before coming to America, had taken the children to live near Shahn's paternal grandfather. He was said to be a large, strong, kindly, warm-hearted man. Little Ben was devoted to him as though to a surrogate father. This paragon of a man was called Wolf Leib, which translates to wolf lion. Allegory was both a transition for Shahn and a waypoint in art fashion. Ben Shahn was an established public personality whose art still had wide appeal when the new wave of abstraction swept over him. In the late 40s and early 50s, Jackson Pollock's paroxysm of creation took the center stage away from Shahn's careful symbolism. Abstract expressionists were the new pantheon, and the critic Clement Greenberg was the new guru. Shahn's art occupied a middle ground between representation and abstraction. Nevertheless, in 1947, Greenberg said Shahn's work was essentially beside the point as far as ambitious present-day painting is concerned. Shahn fired back in his book that what he called paint-only, non-objective art had removed content from form, and that in neglecting content, it had lost touch with human value, emotion, and meaning. That's a debate we can't settle here. It's enough to say that Allegory clearly has content. In Ben Shahn's words, form is the shape of content, and these are stark, definite forms. But at the same time, don't underestimate Allegory's modernity. The abstract preoccupations with surface, gesture, and color are already there, even if, for a while, Shahn's recognizable figures dropped out of style. Thanks, and I hope you get to come to the museum. Allegory has a lot more impact in person. It may resonate with you as deeply as it does with me.